Okay. Greetings, welcome to the Transforming Assessment webinar series. Today's session is on digital equity in online assessment, and our presenters today are Jo Tay and Sarah Lambert from CRADLE, which is the Centre for Research and Assessment in Digital Learning at Deakin University in Melbourne. So what else? I think Jo's going first.
Yep, so let's kick off. So yeah, thanks for having me. I'll be talking about digital equity or inequity in online assessment and focusing on students' experiences and then thinking about what we can learn about design from this. As I begin, I do need to acknowledge that I am on Wurundjeri country, the Wurundjeri people of Kulin Nation. I pay respects to elders past, present and emerging and thank them for their care of the land. I also need to acknowledge that the work that I'll be presenting today isn't all my own. We had a lovely team working on the project: Rolla, Margaret, Jo, Mary, Lois and Paige. And we also had a number of students and staff at Deakin and CQU participating as well. So this work could not have happened alone, and the project was also funded by the Nishi Research Grants Program, which was in turn funded by the Australian Government Department of Education, Skills and Employment. So background to my talk is that assessment is obviously integral to student success in higher education. It is the thing that they can't escape and the thing that they need to do in order to pass units, to complete a course, to graduate. And as the years have gone by, there has been an increasing number of students from diverse backgrounds participating in higher education, and this has been both an overt push and a welcoming by universities, but also just a general sort of recognition that everyone should have opportunities to head into higher education. And so if we think about this diverse student population and the legal requirements, especially around students with disabilities, to ensure that they can also participate in education to an equal extent, then there are a lot of things like assessment adjustments and accommodations that are provided to individual students. However, these don't completely work for everyone, and they also don't account for all the dimensions of student diversity that there could be. And while there are lots of studies looking at diverse students' experiences in higher education, there were few studies focusing specifically on equity group students' assessment experiences. So that's what I'm sharing with you today. So just to give an indication of numbers, the dotted line is all domestic students in Australia, and the three coloured lines, for which the scale's on the left, are just the three groups that we looked at in our project. So students with disabilities, students from a low SES background, and students from regional or remote areas. And so you can see, while all the lines are sort of roughly going up at the same rate, the likelihood is that we're just going to encounter more students from diverse backgrounds. So in the project, we wanted to take a little bit of a different lens and think about the social and material arrangements and configurations that impact on inclusion. And we talked about high-stakes times assessments because exams seem to be the thing for which adjustments are most commonly made. So we figured they're probably going to be the most critical point to look at. And we wanted to look at that intersectional version of disadvantage, so looking at students with disability, but also with additional equity group characteristics. And then we wanted to think about how we could change assessment design and what would actually work to improve inclusion. So we did this through two phases. The first phase was a number of student interviews. We ended up with 40 interviews across Deakin and CQU, and we invited students through the accessibility service, but then also tracked their additional equity group membership. And then once we had those interviews, we took that information and shared it in participatory workshops, which included academics, academic development staff, people from the Accessibility Service and students themselves to nut through these ideas around inclusion and assessment design together. So an overview of the whole project findings is basically that inclusion assessment is quite messy and contextual. There's no single solution, but through both phases of the project, we found that a lot of changes, and some of them were, quite small tweaks, might actually support a lot of students in different circumstances. And part of this was around staff and student relationships as well, in terms of how that works for inclusion. And yeah, we found that exam and assessment design could be greatly improved, and some of this stuff actually took place in the context of COVID already, so that was good to see some things happening. So I thought I'd share with you today a few examples of digital inequity. And you can think about which bit is the equity bit and which bit's the inequity bit. So Samira says, with a learning disability, handwriting and speed is not my friend. I think I couldn't do this degree without adjustments, to be quite honest. Without the allowances of extra time and being able to do the exams via the computer and using spell check, I don't think I'd get the marks that I would, even though my knowledge base is good. And so you can see that a computer here is actually improving equity for Samira in assessment. And Ben also had a similar experience. He noted in the context of getting to do exams at home due to COVID, there's no distractions within the home environment. I have all the different software packages I need to be able to use, and I can go and use my computer. It's essentially being within my own exam room, just being at home rather than at the university. I don't need to worry about my exam accommodations being ignored or something like that, or the room changing. None of those problems occur. And you can sense here that he perhaps has had some problems in the past, and a lot of the students we interviewed talked about just that switch from having your accessibility requirements outlined with the accessibility unit, but then when it comes to the time of the assessment, the time of the exam, then things not all the information is always transferred across clearly, and then things don't work out quite as they expected. And that can have a huge impact on a student's ability to actually do the assessment. And one more. So Hannah, this is from a rural, regional, remote sort of situation. She says, obviously, it's more expensive for country kids to go to university because we don't really have any choice but to live away from home. And also, that's not excellent. I wasn't able to qualify for youth allowance despite having an entire working gap year and making all this money and being independent for that year. When we got kicked off campus, I was actually deciding whether to stay in Melbourne or go home. And I actually decided to stay here because I would have had the study space here, whereas at home, I wouldn't really. And if I was at home, my internet is so shoddy, there's no way I would have been able to be on Blackboard Collaborate or Zoom or anything like that. I think all in all, it's probably the right choice to stay here for internet connection alone. And I think this is a theme that we've encountered not just with students in this study, but hearing from other reports of students studying through COVID and the absolute importance of internet access and the stable internet access to be able to participate in study and also assessment, particularly when things like online proctoring are required. So what can we do about assessment design? And I only shared a very brief examples of the digital inequity, but these things around assessment design also come from students. So the length and duration of assessment needs to be considered for equity purposes. And Charlie here reports that one of my exams was more like an assignment, came out on Thursday at 1 p.m. and submitted at Friday at 1 p.m. That, to me, didn't really feel like an exam. It felt like another assignment because he had 24 hours to work on it. Me and whoever I spoke to, we found that we were working on it from 1 o'clock till 9 p.m. They said it should take 2 hours, but it really took much longer, and you just don't know when to stop. That I found wasn't really helpful. And so not only does the length and duration of assessment need to be considered in how we construct the assessment, but I think there's also something here around clear instructions to students and expectation setting before they get to the point of the exam about how much time and what the assessment, what a completed assessment could look like. And for Charlie, I think and some other students who also reported there was a lot of anxiety and fatigue around spending more time than perhaps they would have previously on their assessment tasks. And Ben also kind of has the same experience, but a little bit more targeted advice. So he says the unit coordinator was saying this should be just so easy to complete, and then it takes 22 pages of working to try and work it out. Maybe they need to try and do the exam themselves. Is it reasonable? Can they do it within 6 pages of working, or is it too much? Can it actually be done within this period of time? Actually test it before throwing it out to students. And so here, again, it is about thinking about realistic expectations for what's happening in an assessment task, and thinking about what's most important to be demonstrated within that task. Also on the subject of authenticity, a few students had some really great comments. So Eliza said, it is easier to be prepared for an online exam in your own home, in your own space, and you do not have to deal with other people. But at the same time, the career path that I'm following, you can't do it at home. You have to go into the clinic, you have to be scrutinised by the doctors checking your work. I feel it's something that you need to get used to doing. And a range of other students talked about the studying online business and being assessed online meant that they weren't able to demonstrate the same kinds of skills that they might have expected to demonstrate in a lab situation or like a practical assessment task. And then Rebecca also pointed out that some things about assessment in this online space were actually more like real life. So she says, it's the closest to what I do in practice in that I have all my resources, I need to provide advice. I obviously have a word count in doing that because if I get it too long, the client's not going to read it. And so developing those skills in writing concisely and communicating them in a more understandable manner is, I think, one of the things that's best prepared me for practice. With the exams, I don't think I'll ever be in practice and be told, like, you must write this memorandum of advice in 2 hours and you only have one book to do it. Go. So here, a more sort of digital situation that's open book, that still perhaps is time limited but is not just 2 hours, might work better. And you can see now that there's a lot of nuance, and I can see in the chat as well that there's a lot of nuance around, well, what type of task, where are you going with it, what subject is it in. So to sum up the things that we identified in the project specifically around exam design, firstly, the first thing to do is ensure task requirements are realistic. And I think this was particularly in the context of switching to that online exam environment, because the things that we might previously have done in an in-person invigilated setting like MCQs, a lot of changes had to be made to the questions, and this ended up with a lot of creep in terms of how many things students were required to do. Secondly was around setting reasonable conditions, and this went to what resources could be accessed, and a few students commented that the locked down exam platforms meant that they couldn't actually use the spell check that they were normally accustomed to, say if they had dyslexia, which was quite problematic for them. Third was communicate and be approachable, and this is less about the specific online configuration but more about the support from staff up to the point of doing the assessment, and also being open to providing adjustments and providing extensions, which sort of dovetails into number 4, which is around streamlining adjustment requests. And this is really from the perspective that students did have to go through a process initially to get a plan set up for them, to talk with the disability services or whatever called at your institution to formulate the things that would actually provide them with a similar level of ability to participate. And so they've they've done all this paperwork, they've had extra meetings, and to come to the point where someone who's a lecturer, and maybe it's the first time they've encountered them, and said, and said, oh, look, I've got this plan, these are the things I need. For that person to say, oh, I need more information, or, what else am I, to go through that process again and re-justify why they need that adjustment was also quite time consuming. And if you think about all of us having a limited amount of effort and time to spend on things, if students are spending all their time on doing that, then they're not spending it on learning or doing the assessment task. And so the final thing we cheekily suggested in terms of making exams more inclusive is just to replace an exam with a different task. And this might seem more challenging, but we do also have a whole inclusive assessment design framework, which is up on our website. So that's another resource for you to look at. So I've sort of bombarded everyone with a whole lot of things to think about. But I guess moving forward is not something that's particularly easy. And from this project, we found that there were some important ingredients for how it would happen. And firstly, it's about having the time and space for discussions to work through assessment design processes. So in the workshops, we did have some lovely time together to nut through the problems, and that was quite helpful for actually working out what we could do. The second thing that was really helpful was having stakeholder representatives present at discussions. So having students in the room meant that we could bounce the ideas off the students and say, do you think that this is helpful, or do you think it's just going to make things worse? And similarly, having the accessibility staff in the room meant that, they were like, well, this is something that happens quite commonly, and yeah, it's usually pretty easy to implement, or not. And the last thing that happened in our project was that it was really a safe environment for incremental change. And I guess if there's any sort of university leadership in the room or listening to the recording, this would also extend to things like being okay if the assessment doesn't work entirely well the first time and students really hate it and give everyone low unit evaluation scores. So having that safe environment where people are supported to make changes and try something a bit different is really important. So I mentioned some resources, and Matthew popped a couple of blog links in the chat. And yes, so if you Google reimagining exams and Deakin, I think it'll come up. So we've got a little, those 5 top tips plus an inclusive assessment design framework, and also some sort of university policy level recommendations as well that you can have a look through, and the workshop resources in case you want to run similar workshops yourself. So that's all from me. Thanks, and I guess I'll pass to Sarah.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Jo. I've had a pause because I was answering someone in the chat, so typing away, and at the same time when you threw over to me. So thanks everyone for coming on Wednesday Eve, and I think what I'm about to talk about will kind of dovetail really nicely. So I'm going to talk about the equity concerns with online exam proctoring, and I wanted to just also just shout out that I'm coming to you from Djadjawarrung lands, unceded territory in the Central Goldfields district, where we've just had the most beautiful cleansing rain, and the reduction of pollens is palpable. Good news for allergy sufferers. I hope you're all well. Moving forward, what I'll talk about today is the online exam proctoring, experiences, controversies overseas in Canada and the USA with Proctorio, and in Australia with ProctorU. I'm not going to dwell on that, but I want to just summarise what the students said and did. And that summarises up to involving risks to equity students in particular, but also risks to all students. And there's not going to be any finger pointing here, particularly, if you might have been involved with the Australian example. It just, it's just a learning experience. Things happened rapidly during COVID. It's about learning from that. And so what I thought might be useful is to spend some time together throwing some ideas about alternatives. So we're going to use a risk reduction framework for how we can remove, replace, refine or reduce the kinds of risks that the student experience and indeed some of the emerging research tells us can be an issue with online exam proctoring. So overseas, massive media coverage and massive student petitions. Here's a summary that's quoting from an article out in 2020. Since the beginning of the school year, many students have spoken out against the technology. Petitions with thousands of signatures have called it ableist and discriminatory, intrusive, unsafe, inaccessible, and a huge invasion of privacy. And so you will have seen, if you go looking for it, not just a single university, but there has been numerous online petitions, mostly started by students and student advocacy groups. So here's one for Miami University, Boulder, Colorado. I'm not even sure what UIUC stands for. I have forgotten, I must confess, but you get the drift. And another institution, No Proctorio, our students do not want to be spied on. You can see over 5,000 signatures there, and American Canadian institutions are typically a lot smaller than Australian ones, so these are big numbers for there. Open letter regarding the use of Proctorio from a student services organisation. And when I read all of those, what we see is the stories and the impacts are negative on mental health. So concerns about the added stress and the negative impacts that being observed during an exam places on students, and how this can lead to poor student performance, penalising students who are already stressed or anxious. And you may have seen on social media, particularly through when institutions moved rapidly to these sorts of technologies during COVID, many students sharing videos, crying, experiencing actual acute mental health events, panic attacks. And they're not only reacting to the actual platform and the observation, but I think they're talking also about the fear, the actual fear of failure, which is very strong in the mix. And so I wanted to draw your attention to this very well considered and argued piece from 2020, Our Bodies Encoded, Algorithmic Test Proctoring in Higher Education, which is published in a really interesting peer-reviewed kind of online journal called Hybrid Pedagogy. And so in this review of student and staff concerns, what they're talking about here is this underrepresented or minority students are penalised the most as being ableist, as being racist, as being sexist, and posing risks to trans and non-binary students. But in addition to that, you can see through the media campaigns and the platforms that the students have taken to students perceiving it's a risk to all students' privacy. And so let's just check a couple of slides on each of these points. So ableist, assuming that the normal is an able-bodied person is, I guess, a quick summary of that term. And so when eye tracking is used by these applications, students with visual impairments such as blindness or nystagmus, or students who identify as autistic or neuroatypical may be flagged. Flagged meaning flagged as a problem, flagged as a risk. Even common test-taking behaviours such as reading the question out loud, listening to music, or behaviours such as hyperactivity associated with ADHD can be flagged. And while there can be sometimes accommodations for things like bathroom breaks, the fact that most proctoring software default settings label any bodies or behaviours that don't conform to the able-bodied neurotypical ideal as a threat to academic integrity. Racist. While some test proctoring companies develop their own facial recognition software, most purchase it. And these data sets are typically developed by looking at a lot of photographs which in some people's research have been found to be very heavily white. So These technologies generally function similarly and have shown a consistent inability to identify people with darker skin or even tell the difference between Chinese people. And so this article says that facial recognition literally encodes the invisibility of black people and the racist stereotype that all Asian people look the same, which if you're experiencing that as a student of colour or a student from an Asian background, and you know, particularly if you've already had some of those experiences, it just would be particularly upsetting. Sexist. So yes, this is not an equal experience necessarily for, it's potentially a gendered experience too. So a common feature of proctoring systems is to allow course owners to download the recordings of their students to keep on a local device. And of course, owners can view the recordings of their students as many times as they want, when and wherever they want. And these features and settings create a system that they call asymmetric surveillance, a lack of accountability, things which have always created a risk for abuse and sexual harassment. And technologies like these have a long history of being abused, largely by heterosexual men at the expense of women's bodies, privacy, and dignity. Certain test settings flag loud noises and leaving the view of the camera is suspicious. And you can imagine if you've got kids, small kids running around, that's just going to be almost impossible to avoid. So not everyone, as this article makes sense, but can and parenting, which often is not always, of course, but if you are breastfeeding, definitely a women's thing. Yeah, if all the students can't always afford childcare or be able to leave the house or set aside quiet time for a test. And also the article talks about how it can really reinforce the sort of trauma of being misgendered by trans and non-binary students, having to, as Joe was talking about, reassert things that they've already asserted numerous times about their ID on their current gender expression and so on. And so this really so this article provides additional links to when those kinds of risks have become reality for people. And so this is, although it sounds, I suppose, to many of us who may not have experienced some of these sorts of oppressive situations in day-to-day life, and then again having that reinforced through technology, it may feel a little bit alarmist, but I encourage you to have a quiet read of the article and click through to some of the links where some of these things have unfortunately come true. So in summary, what we have is underrepresented students penalised. So women with children, anyone who shares a bedroom with siblings, loud noises, leaving the camera, all suspicious. Ableists, so ADHD and autistic people may look away from the camera or have fast eye movements. That's suspicious. Even people with back injuries who can't sit for long periods of time, suspicious. Racist, algorithms designed and developed with white people. Black people are not seen or identified. Asian people are not able to be differentiated. Now here, I'm just going to paste in. I'm going to paste in the chat. She says, can she multitask? Say copy link. I think so. A couple of resources, and I just think you might really be interested to find out a little bit more about Joy Bulamwini, and she is the founder of the Algorithmic Justice League, and she's done PhD research on this and actually looking to correct the balance of imagery and have a whole mass of data of people of colour who then become incorporated into AI systems. So there is a whole design justice movement out there, and if you Google design justice, you will begin to see some really fascinating work. And Joy herself has got a really famous, well-shared TED Talk. And so yeah, you can also check that out. So but then all students, there's privacy concerns again for all students. So cameras can be used to take pictures panning around students' bedrooms. Personal and sensitive data about students' affiliations and their health issues are present in the spaces that they inhabit, as they should be. software some software can geotag students' location, and so a combined personal information plus some kind of physical location, there is a risk of students being stalked, women unfortunately in particular. And this article also talks about the bad history of surveillance, say software being misused in the past, in particular sexual harassment of women. So in Australia, you might say, surely we can do better, but and I think we can, and I think we'll soon hear from people who I think making different decisions, and there is a lot more positive news coming up soon. But in actual fact, the University of Queensland had an experience with ProctorU and in 2020. And it was a kind of a replay. So we had a lot of students really upset. This was brought in a short space of time. And as we all know, institutions are really pushed and really genuinely trying to find solutions. But there was a big petition. The UQ Student Union ran it. There was a lot of media, and the local MP was petitioned by numerous students and ended up writing an open letter in UQ, which I'll share little parts of that. And then in terms of the privacy issues for all students more recently, we had SBS News reported in August 2020 that personal records of 444,000 ProctorU users have been reportedly hacked and leaked in hacker forums. So the privacy issues also loomed very quickly within the Australian context. So in this statement, which I've got a link in this presentation too, there was, and apparently when this first came forward, the university said, fair enough, we will find a way to make alternative arrangements for students who don't want to participate. But at the time Michael Berkman was writing this statement, he said it was clear from the student stories that in actual fact alternatives hadn't yet, hadn't played out this way, is what he was saying. All the kinds of biometric data, the records and so on and so forth. So this little dot list is fairly salient. So the UQ students, and this is his summary, have reported poor behaviour by examination supervisors, including looking through a student's private files and being late and not knowing where to find particular keys on a keyboard. Exams being delayed by hours, significantly increasing stress for students, loud and distracting noises from the supervisor, supervisors just disappearing and not responding when students tried to submit, supervisors submitting the exam before the student had finished, forcing them to reschedule, inconsistency about required ID, problems accessing adjustments for students with a disability, and supervisors asking to take multiple pictures of female students with and without glasses, while male students with glasses reported this didn't happen to them. So it's not a glowing first experience. So you can see why the students, have taken this matter up and why things are being looked at. But as I said, universities have been in a really difficult position. It's really hard to do thorough piloting and testing in compressed timeframes. And I must just come back here and say, Michael himself says, I appreciate that UQ staff have been working incredibly hard to adapt, but it's clear this software is creating unreasonable stress. So it's no finger pointing, as I said. It was a really difficult time, but let's see what we can learn from this and take these kinds of experiences forward when our institutions are asking us for advice and asking us where to look. And so, it's a risk. So let's take a risk management approach, remove, replace, or refine, or reduce are the kind of things we look at in that space. So, first of all, remove. It's a big call, but can we actually cancel this and trust students to do their exams without cheating? I know it's a radical concept, but there are some people considering that and moving forward with it. And I mean, this is just a top of the head brainwave I had with it, but could we not, review results if grades were either, higher or lower than other outcomes, for example, which would be more work, but then everything's more work. could we cancel these and replace end of semester exams with alternative assessments? And by way of an example, during COVID, RMIT said, no, we won't do exams, we're going to do project-based assessments. So some institutions have taken an alternate path there. And there could be heaps of alternatives. I'm just starting to look in the chat. Yeah, John Cripps is talking about intensives, so blocks. Yep, so you come for a particular period and you get a whole lot of stuff done. That's part of this kind of remove the whole exam thing. Replace or refine. So, you know, can we use different settings so that it's less intrusive? Can we not allow people to save things in particular fashion? You know, if you save something, maybe there need to be a second person checking. Can we use better trained proctors? Ones hired by the university. That was another thing brought up by the students. Don't give us these people from overseas, give us people that are employed by the university and have some accountability. What about allowing female students to have female proctors? A choice there, and ensure there's sufficient trained female proctors. And that's sort of a choice given to people in various medical settings. You know, if this risk is real, and I believe it is, then why don't we think about that? Distance students use testing centres in their local community. That's been going on for over 50 years with the Open University type of model. So we could look at testing centres in communities where the internet is also good, which would be helpful for those students struggling on bandwidth in regions. You know, the staff at those centres are just really skilled. I'm sure they could do an ID check. And we could replace a different tool or method of online proctoring that's actually less intrusive. And I'm going to call on Matthew to talk to that, I think, very shortly. So I think I'm pretty much almost done. So yeah, just reducing. So minimise the use of that system to exceptional circumstances only, or only using some programs where you really can't swap things out assessment-wise, or allowing students to opt into using and give an alternate assessment to the majority, which is a sort of inclusive approach. Never using for students with mental health issues, always have that alternative there. And always tell the students if the system will be used prior to census date so they can withdraw from the unit without financial penalty, as that was another matter raised by students with the time framing. By the time, with the COVID situation being so compressed, by the time the universities had made a decision about this, it was past census, so students felt very pressured. And moving forward, I think we can at least give certainty on that. I think that would be, I'm sure, already something that has been adjusted. So I'm going to go back and just end on that and throw it over to Matthew to have a chat about your alternate platform.
Yeah, it's not a platform per se. I mean, I think Macquarie University took, I suppose, what we might call a quickly but slowly approach at the same time. So let's wind back to the beginning of 2020 in Australia, when it hit us in Australia really hard. And essentially it was halfway through our session one, our first semester, when it was sort of became obvious that the country was shutting down. And of course, you know, it was somewhat past the census date. So at Macquarie, we basically swapped 100% of exams to online non-invigilated, because we didn't have any other choices really. We did momentarily for about 15 minutes think about, oh, can we use an outsourced proctoring service, but was quickly decided that no, that wasn't going to happen in the time available. But what we did do in session 2 of 2020 was to pilot different solutions. So we looked at an automated screen recording system. We looked at an online proctoring service, a well-known one, I won't mention their name. And we also piloted using Zoom ourselves. And I understand I think it might be ACODE or a group like that did a survey about what systems were being used for exams, and Zoom came up as quite a popular choice amongst many, including at University of Melbourne. They got quite some nice student guides on there. And we piloted those different solutions. The first one, the automated screen recording, was frankly not particularly effective as an invigilation tool. It presented students with lots of technical problems. You know, we had things like, you know, students not able to start exams, or, you know, they were pointing their camera at the ceiling or something. And of course, there's no way to intervene in real time with such systems. So you essentially get an invalid session, and then what do? You either accept it or the poor student has to do the exam again. I don't think that's a very satisfactory outcome. The second one, of course, was the outsourced proctoring. And I think all of the issues that you, Sarah, mentioned in your report from UQ kind of came out with us as well. Overall, my conclusion in the report to the university was 3 types of torture for students, all simultaneous. That's what I called it, 3 types of torture. And whilst, yes, I suppose when it did work, it worked reasonably well from an invigilation point of view, but there was just too many instances where students couldn't start exams or had problems or had inconsistent experiences or et cetera. So all of those issues came out. In the end, we said, no, we're not going to do that again. And when we did the Zoom pilots, because, you know, as per your recommendations, the people who were supervising were trained by our exams office. So we could brief those people. They were accountable to our university. They were all plugged into our problem-solving networks, you know, the IT, the student services, the wellbeing office was on standby. So we had all of those support infrastructure, if you will, behind it. And I think that came out a bit better. Now, to be honest, yes, you don't have the same scope of control, like you can't see what's on the students' screens. But at the same time, you know, we were working against a timeline, we were working against what we had at our disposal. And I think overall the solution is better than either no invigilation at all, because we had an explosion in academic integrity cases. So, you know, there was some pressure to do something about it, or at least give the students a feeling that we're doing something about it, maybe. A bit of a joke there. But, you know, my feeling was the Zoom solution was a reasonable middle road. And I was trying to aim for something in designing the approach to, you know, online invigilation that does not suck was kind of does not suck for the students was kind of my I guess my thinking about how to move forward with that. In session 1 this year, we did 1,300 sittings. That was mainly for students, because by that time, session 1 in Australia, early 2021, at least in Sydney, we were opened up again. We were able to run some on-campus exams. So there was a selection of on-campus exams, and we used the Zoom for the students who could not attend the on-campus exams for various travel restriction related reasons. So it gave us a bit more experience. And now come session 2, 2020, which is actually just starting, our exam period starting next week. But most of this session, a lot of the eastern states in Australia went back into lockdown again. So we were, of course, okay, we need to do more of this. So we decided to ramp up the Zoom as one of the options. So we're still doing non-invigilated exams. We have tried to schedule some on-campus exams, but they're going to be really limited in this context, like those things that you really need to be on campus to test, particularly in health sciences and things like that, with all the appropriate social distancing in place. And then we've ramped up the Zoom invigilation. We're planning for 23,000 sittings starting next week for our Zoom exams, and we're just finishing this week on practice. So last week and this week with a practice, no zero stakes practice sessions, the students could get used to it, and have been starting to collect some feedback from students in all of these as well. But I've probably talked enough. So if anybody else, you know, wants to make comments, please type into the text chat, or you may, if you like, put up your hand and, you know, indicate you might want to ask a question through your microphone. Sarah or Joe, you may wish to make some comments along the way as it's going as well.
I just see some examples of Claudia's talking about using Zoom and a product I hadn't heard of with the pathway students, and that's, you know, always nice when you hear someone's tried something and it's working for them. So yeah, it was really interesting preparing for this and talking to you, Matthew, and some others, and getting a sense that Australia was doing some top grade DIY tinkering and innovating, and I think we've good at that. It's great, because I think outsourcing to you know, outsourcing has, in the edtech space generally, has a number of risks around what we do with data and losing capacity to do things in-house. So it's always interesting. There's always benefits, you know, risks and benefits of everything. But personally, I suppose as someone who's always been committed to building staff capacity, I really enjoy seeing it where universities have just kept their investment in-house in their own staff, to be frank. So it's nice when that can happen. It's really hard to, there was a question about whether I had any new data, and it's actually been really difficult. And I, as I said, I'm not demonising any uni, but and UQ for their early experience, you know, everyone would have been looking and it would have been really tough. But honestly, I couldn't find any formal recognition of the project on their website. So, you know, it was not possible to get, as a member of the public, any official data on what was happening there. I just happened to have studying there, so I suppose I found out about it through a totally different network, and then it just exploded on the media, so it was kind of there. But I also looked back on their website and also looked on the ACODE website for any reports around this, and was unable to find anything. So it does seem to me that this sort of institutional information is not you know, they don't want to probably publicly discuss it, which is a bit of a shame, because when we do fall
just
short,
trying
it
to think
makes
where I
it
did see
hard.
that. Was it ACODE? Michael Sankey, if you
ACODE would
contact
do it,
him, he'll
yeah.
have access to the report. I know it did come out somewhere. I'm just trying to remember where I saw it as well, where the report came out on the use of online exam tools in the Australian sector.
Yeah,
There was
because I
one done
certainly
last
hit up
year,
their website, but
yeah,
since I
yeah.
no longer am an ACODE rep after being one for a long time, I don't get the things.
Yes,
Yeah.
the links that you have to be a member on there, sign up to their
You have
website
to
or
be a
something to
member,
get access to.
absolutely.
Yeah, it's a little bit tricky, but
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Yes, Ray, I feel the same. I wish you'd been collecting data on this, but and Matthew, when we had our informal chat, a bit similar, it would have been great to have had a sort of ongoing ethics application for looking at interventions in assessment that were just a rolling 3-year thing that could have, you know, began.
Yeah, I mean, I
That was
regret not
open
getting
enough.
ethics as well,
Yeah.
because
Well,
you know it was an emergency and we're all just rushing to solve the problem, and
but
things
that's when
like
you get the
battling ethics committees was the last thing on my mind, you know. So
is the last thing you have time to do. I think what we
yeah,
need to do is put in 3-year rolling ones and know that they're just in place, and you can do any kind of within the frame of what's been approved, you know, surveys with students that are anonymous, that are not done by the, you know, the coordinator, you know, that kind of thing. So you already have that. I think the trick is to do it now and have it forward for 3 years, so you can just do those whatever next thing emerges as
yes, I'm trying to put one in at the moment
thing we're
actually,
running.
and they keep coming back with yet another thing that I have to address, and it's like, oh God, talk about
It
torture.
is really full on.
You know,
It is six times the torture. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, if student thinks online proctoring's bad, get them to apply for an ethics.
That's it.
Yeah, anyway, let's stop that.
So is there anyone else in the room has done an alternate, a sort of you know, pulled something together with alternate sorts of text, or perhaps had any experience with redesigning out of an exam? I'd love to hear from anyone if they had.
Sally Brown and Kay Samble, I think they've probably got the best resource, and Anne posted the link in earlier. SallyBrown.net.
Yes.
The COVID-19 assessment collection. I think she's got some brilliant ideas. They did present in Transforming Assessment a month or so ago. That you can look up that one too. But they had this. The whole idea was, you know, okay, we've got these, you know, traditional pen on paper exams. We can't do them anymore. Whoa, what can we do instead? And they started collecting a whole bunch of examples and developed a sort of I guess a template or a formula formula kind of guidelines, you know, what sort of things you need to do to construct your alternative assessments. And it's basically, you know, constructive alignment, for want of a better word, you know, that kind of idea. And they had you know, it's sort of a table you can just fill in, okay, what's the learning goals, what you want the students to do, you know, that kind of stuff, to be able to develop your alternative assessment. But they did have some quite good ideas there.
Thanks, Ray. You're on it. I'm loving that. A direct link to the good stuff. All right, I'll check that out.
Joanne's got a hand up. Do you want to speak, Joanne? You're quite welcome to turn on your mic and ask a question if you'd like.
Thank you. So Joanne Larkins here, mathematician, statistician, Federation University. Some of my colleagues did some really interesting things in, well, IT's the thinking of at the moment, where IT and maths both seem to be doing a online exam, open book, followed up by a negotiated discussion with the students, so short video chats. And one of the IT lecturers designed with her students how that video component would look and what they wanted to be asked about. And it actually ended up being a reflective session, which the students felt was much more relaxed, and they were quite happy to do that sort of Viva rather than be asked about particular exam questions. It was a really, really valuable learning experience for both the students and the lecturer.
I love that, and a lot of the assessment literature talks about trying to integrate feedback to ensure that it's a conversation. So yeah, you could just have a conversation. Woo, fantastic. Yeah, I'm Dim the same. Who is
Griffith Uni have been
blogging
doing
about it? Yeah.
Griffith Uni have been Ray Jobest has just talked about the Griffith University's interactive oral assessments, and they scaled that up to classes of 300 students. And I think it's got, you know, because there's an authentic scenario involved, and there's, you know, obviously some sort of identity checking and recording that can happen because it's done online, and it seemed to be reasonably scalable. So it seemed to have tackled most of the big problems that we find with doing practical, you know, how do we practically implement this stuff to make it work and scalable. Again, there was, thanks Ray, put in that transforming assessment. Sort of all knowledge about assessment at the moment. Yeah, we did assessment session with them. Encourage people to follow it up, and I think they have published materials and how-tos and things on their website.
Yeah, and from the integrity side, I think it's one of the solutions that, or one of the ways that you can mitigate the risk of cheating that Phil Dawson has also suggested and tested. And apparently it's really obvious when a student fronts up to an oral and doesn't know what they're talking about. So
indeed,
also good.
Because it's interactive, you know, you can dig. If you suspect the student is just repeating what's in the textbook, and you say, okay, what if I change this, or what about that, or, you know, what if I change that variable around? You know, and I think this technique applied to all sorts of different areas. So, you know, you may get the student to do an exam, and then you have a quick 10-minute chat with them about it to discover if they, you know, really understand what they handed in. So,
we used to do this in the design teaching profession. So it's a very common part of the portfolio assessment is that the student speaks to their process of development of their project. And I always found it quite fascinating that you could ask the student to just say, well, how did you do this? How did you get this project done? Like, what was the first thing you started with? And we would quickly find the students who had outsourced the creation of their graphics to someone else, because they could give you absolutely no narrative on how they made the thing. And it didn't happen very often, but yeah, it was really clear when it did happen. Yeah, it's quite fascinating what you learn as an educator through those conversations.
Claudia raises a point about ESL students, and I think,
yes,
you know, some of it is about preparation, allowing the students to practice. You know, it's not the sort of thing you drop on a student with 5 minutes notice. You give them, you know, warning and practice that it's coming, and maybe get them to do some. I'm a strong supporter of the idea of a practice run, zero states practice runs for anything that's new to a student, any technique that you're going to apply in assessment that's new, get them to practice it, or in some sort of formative sense, so that the students are able to feel, you know, what it feels like, what is it like, what's the interactions like, what are the technical steps to get through this assessment. And I think my findings anyway have been that students feel much more confident after having done that practice run, because it removes all that unknown, you know, the unknown side out of the equation, gives them more certainty of how it's doing. And I think the idea of saying, say for ESL students, also reassuring them that we're not marking you down if you can't pronounce every word correctly or your sentence structure is not perfect. We're looking for the ideas and the argument, not the expression in English.
Yep. And also on the inclusion side, in a subsequent project, we've been nutting out other things and considering diverse students, including students who do not have English as their first language. And actually, it turns out that some of them really struggle to write, or would prefer not to have to write an extended essay on a topic, and would actually prefer to talk it instead. And Claudia mentions video presentations as well, and that was one of the things that was offered as an alternative in one of the units I was working with, and a lot of students did take it up and found it quite helpful. So I don't think we should stereotype students as well in terms of what they feel they're comfortable with.
Yeah, asking the students whether they feel comfortable is probably a nice step too.
Yeah.
I never got around to turning my video on. Hello everyone who's stuck around till the end. It's been great seeing all your examples, and thanks Joe also and Matthew for organising.
My pleasure. We've probably just got 2 minutes to go, so if anybody's got some extra questions, that will be fantastic. Otherwise, I'm going to type the feedback survey link into the text chat once I stop talking.
Wonderful.
And thanks everyone for contributing to the chat and sharing resources as well.
I'm really terrible at typing and yeah, typing and talking at the same time.
Multitasking is so overrated.
I think it's the older. I used to be able to do it when I was younger, but you know, as you get older, your brain tends to get mushy. I think it does in my case anyway. Yeah. Be great if people could fill it in. This is our last session for the year. Just want to mention that if people are interested, the Ascolite conference is coming up late November, early December. It is actually a hybrid conference this year. Last year it was fully online. This year there is a small registration fee, I think of about $150 if you want to attend online. But it's kind of like the main session in Australasia for technology enhanced education in the tertiary sector. So encourage people to go along and get involved in that. The hours may not necessarily be all that appealing for people over in Europe, but they'll probably be recording all the sessions. So yeah. So I just say thank you very much to Joe and Sarah. It was great having you along. And hopefully we'll all see you again in 2022 when we launch our new series then. But Australia is going into hiatus soon. It'll be our summer break and we'll be all off to hopefully holiday destinations very soon.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'm going to stop the recording.